Good afternoon to everybody. The Austrian Culture Forum presents this event with the kind efforts of Dr. Raheja, an eminent psychiatrist and director of Hope, the Huppert. Before I go any further, I would like to request the Shastriya Affairs, Mr. Matthias Radosvich, who is among us, to kindly come and welcome all our panelists and guests officially and start the session. Dr. Matthias.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. As you can see, we have opted for a COVID-compliant format, which is a bit of a hybrid format. So a few people here in the room who met physically, and more people have joined us online.
Matthias, thank you very much. We are trying to be 100% compliant with the pandemic. The very few participants we have invited here, and we are trying to ensure that we are able to reach a larger audience via the web mode, the virtual mode. The talk today is in collaboration with the Austrian Cultural Forum of the Austrian Embassy. We're trying to realize on when we talk Vienna and we talk Austria, how can you not talk about Sigmund Freud? Dr. Daru, Huppert, it is my pleasure to invite and pass on the mic to you.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I hope everybody can hear me. And you know, most of you will know at least something about psychoanalysis, that psychoanalysis is a rather low-tech affair, yeah? So, you know, we see patients face-to-face or on the couch. And so I never cease to overcome my disbelief in the staggering possibilities that technology affords us, you know, that I can be sitting here in Vienna talking to you in New Delhi. The title of our gathering today is Philosophy of Freud, Understanding the Human Psyche in Contemporary Times. I mean, it's enticingly generous and open. I'm somewhat I don't really know your background, so I'm very worried of sort of bringing, carrying out to Athens or to New Delhi or to India, which is the birthplace of so much of human wisdom. But I should present you some ideas, which I hope will be engaging enough, and I offer them in the spirit of offering you a field of associations, which we can then perhaps pick up on in the conversation. Yes? And I would beg to differ with one word in the title of our gathering today, which is the word philosophy. Yeah? Freud, as many of you might know, was highly skeptical of philosophy. And I think this is important because he really introduced a distinctive and different way of thinking. And what he was specifically skeptical about was the temptation of philosophers to give grand and totalizing explanations to phenomena. And at one point, he rather scornfully said, that philosophers stuff the holes in our explanation of the universe or of the human mind, with these metaphysical rags. So one can say they're using the dirty underwear or the smelly socks, the metaphysical ideas, to explain what we don't know. And I think one thing which is really particular and distinctive and very important about psychoanalysis is that Freud starts from very particular phenomena. He develops psychoanalysis by listening to what? What does he listen to? Dreams, slips of tongues, jokes, and more closer to the clinical material, to neurotics suffering from some symptoms. He's interested in sexual perversion. And he has an unflinching, gaze at which he turns towards the development of infantile sexuality. But what I'm saying, what I want to emphasize is that the material from which he develops psychoanalysis are the debris of psychic life. And what I mean by this are things we do not attend to or we didn't attend to at the turn of the century at the very least. Yeah? So he turns his gaze to what is fended off, to what we don't want to know, to what we ignore. Yeah? And he develops psychoanalysis from this. And with the effect, I think, which was revolutionary, to legitimize the production of madness. What he finds is that the production of the hysterics, of the compulsive neurotics, and even of the psychotics are meaningful if you can learn to listen. And the effect of this was, to quote the great French anthropologist Lévi-Strauss, that Freud showed us that the neurotic is our brother. So not a degenerate, but somebody very close to us. Now, I agree with the statement, but I would go further. And this is going to be the main thrust of my words today, because I think what Freud discovered is that the neurotic is no one else but ourselves. And to invoke the famous mythological figure so central to psychoanalysis, Oedipus, what does Oedipus discover? What he discovers is that the murderer he's looking for is no one else but himself. Yeah? And I think one of the most recent interesting developments in psychoanalysis, which have already been referred to, is that in recent psychoanalysis, a lot of attention is paid to the functioning of the analyst. What happens to us while we're listening to a patient? How do we react? And this can really, and especially with difficult patients, where treatments get bogged down, where there's a negative therapeutic reaction. So there's a worsening in the condition of the patient, at least for some time. Yeah, it is what one has found is that you can sometimes change these treatments by finding how you, as an analyst, are actually colluding with the patient. Yeah, and how the patient sort of latches on to a residual element of madness working in us. And so I think, psychoanalysis really drives home the very important idea of Pascal, that Blaise Pascal, the French thinker of the 17th century, who said, I'm quoting, "Men are so necessarily mad that not to be mad would amount to a different form of madness." And one of the fundamental propositions of psychoanalysis, starting with Freud's self-analysis, is that you cannot treat madness, and I'm using madness in a very broad category, yeah, unless you face your own. Yeah, and it is often, as I pointed out in treatment, that if we're willing to face on how we collude with the patient, and I will later give an example of this, that treatment can actually progress. Yeah. Another point which I think is very distinctive about psychoanalysis is that, by attending to those things that we ignore, psychoanalysis, it develops a very distinctive form of knowledge, emphasizing things we tend to de-emphasize in our everyday thinking, but not just in our everyday thinking, but also in professional discourses, such as psychiatric discourses. And that is why Theodor Adorno said, in psychoanalysis, there's nothing true except its exaggerations. So psychoanalysis becomes interesting and disturbing when it sort of shocks us. When we want to say, what is this? Why are they talking about sexuality? Why are they talking about infantile experience? Yeah? Why are they exaggerating? And the point I want to make is that that's the whole value of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis without exaggeration would be, one could say, psychobanalysis. So a banal version of what psychoanalysis would be. Psychoanalysis is there to stir up, in some sense, the world. Yeah. Now, one thing I want to emphasize, and we have very little time, so I just can go on with very broad brushstrokes. But one thing I would like to emphasize is that, and what is very little known, is that psychoanalysis begins with the fin de siècle in Vienna. Yeah. Under Victorian conditions, and Freud begins to study what so-called transference neurosis, so mainly hysteria and the compulsive obsessive neurosis, yeah, of his time, and which, by the way, he was the first to see as a nosological entity. But what is less known is that as of latest 1920, with the epoch-making essay on Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud turns to new kinds of pathologies that are not within the neurotic spectrum. Yeah, so he's turning towards what we could broadly speak, three categories, to the what we nowadays call personality disorders, to the perversion, and to psychotic disorders. Yeah, so he's starting to think about and describe patients that are closer to the patients we see as psychoanalysts in our practices today, and at least in Europe, also in psychiatric practices. So patients who suffer from a radical instability of a sense of self. Yeah, what Campbell calls identity diffusion. Patients who suffer from, narcissistic mortifications or flights of grandiosity. Patients who suffer from a sense of emptiness, from a lack of feeling alive or real. Patients who are suffering from addictions. And I particularly have quite a few patients suffering from addictions of the internet, which is a really new and rather disturbing problematic. Yeah? And also, patients who have bizarre sexual predilections, which psychoanalysts are still old-fashioned enough to call perversions. Yeah? And one of the interesting aspects I find is that, once Freud starts turning towards the more grave disturbances, he also writes about the traumatic neurosis. Yeah, and Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, as an after effect of course, the First World War. And I think this is very important for us because one of the things that I think could be interesting for our meeting is to think of the overlap between the pre-existing conditions of some of our patients and the effect of the pandemic. Yeah, and Freud makes a couple of very important points. What he says is that the traumatic neurosis cannot be understood in terms of unconscious fantasy, infantile memories, wish fulfillment. What he's saying that the traumatic neurosis is produced by an excess of excitation, which the psyche cannot deal with, leading to a breakdown in elaboration. And one effect of this is what he terms the repetition compulsion. Yeah, which is most evidently seen, for example, in the dreams of traumatized patients who return to the very scene of traumatization. Yes, but the idea of the repetition compulsion becomes for Freud a more general model to think about severe pathologies. Yes, and I think it's a very interesting, if perhaps general distinction, but or a point he makes, which is, severe pathologies are characterized, he says implicitly, by the repetition of the very same thing that the patient must know leads to disaster. If one thinks of addictions, it's very clear. Nobody knows what the harrowing effects of addictions so well and so intimately as somebody who's addicted. And, at least in some psychoanalytic theories of the psychosis, there's also this idea that even the psychotics, when they get into a psychotic episode, at the beginning, there's a kind of seduction of psychosis, yeah, which the patient gets lured into, and then goes through a period, which leads to a psychotic episode, which is, of course, devastating for the person experiencing, yeah. But Freud also emphasizes another point about the traumatic neurosis, which I think is very important, and which is often overlooked, that, the compulsion to repeat, the traumatic nightmares, panic, and, these are very evident and flamboyant kind of symptoms, which call for attention. But as I said, Freud also pays attention to what we disregard. And one of the points he makes is that in relationship to the traumatic neurosis, what occurs is a kind, are also negative symptoms of withdrawal, of isolation, of non-contact. Yeah, and I think this has been particularly important in relationship to the pandemic we're now experiencing, because one of the things characterizing the pandemic is, of course, that contact with people who are close to you and whom you want to be close to is dangerous. Yeah, so it leads to a rationalization of tendencies of withdrawal, and I'm thinking here, and this is something I want to end with, of two patients, who have pre-existing conditions of a more schizoid nature, yeah. So and who live very withdrawn, and now with the pandemic find a rationalization for the withdrawal. Yeah, For example, there's one patient, he asked me to see me only by telephone. And he doesn't, he works freelance, he quit his job. Well, he didn't quit his job, but he doesn't go, he's not forced to go, yeah? He's not seeing anyone. He very occasionally meets his girlfriend outside, yeah, wearing a mask, an FFP3 mask, which is a mask of maximum security, yeah, wearing gloves. And he's outside and he only touches her with gloves, yeah? And he can rationalize this rather almost delusional, yeah, formation by pointing to the danger, yeah, of the virus, yeah? So I think that...
Dr. Mishra? Sir, Vishal Liman, I can't hear you.
Vishal, mute yourself. There's a lecture going on. Somebody else is speaking.
Way in which the individual is, and also the...
Okay, it's very interesting, this interception. Huh? I shall be brief. I shall be brief and I shall come to an end. So I'd like to point now maybe to another patient and to the point I made before of our own involvement in their suffering. Another patient of mine who's rather schizoid, he has an internet addiction. And, an internet addiction, of course, can be rationalized in the age of pandemia because you spend more time on the internet, you're not meeting people, there's nothing to do, and so forth, yeah? And one thing which I found, which was rather interesting and might be also, fruitful to think about in terms of psychiatric practice, is that his form of internet addiction is one I cannot relate to at all. I have other patients who are addicted to internet, but, they look at the most gory pornography in internet, which might not be my predilection, but at least stirs the imagination. While this patient, what he actually does when he's in the internet, he looks at people playing chess or people playing video games, yeah? Or, scenes of distant galaxies. And I found myself being unable to relate to this. And what happens to me, and this is a patient who comes 4 times a week, so I see him very frequently, lying down on the couch, rather schizoid in his way of relating. So, with a very thin contact, what happened to me while listening to him, I found myself being completely distracted and actually disregarding the patient. So you have this situation where the analyst is actually not interested in what he's listening to. He's not even listening into the symptoms that are being presented. Yeah? And it's once I realized this, that I realized that, to put it very simply, this is a patient who loses contact to himself and contact towards others. And what does he elicit in me? I lose contact towards him. It's like I'm dropping him. Yes? And it's only once I become aware of my participation in his symptom and aware that I too numb myself, for example, by spending a bit more time than I would like to on the internet, for example, wondering when is the vaccination going to come? Yeah, that I can realize that I've been also seduced into a kind of schizoid collusion with this patient, and it's once I realize this and work through my own contribution to the sterility of the treatment in that moment, yeah, that the treatment really changed. Yeah. So my final point, to put it very dramatically, yeah, is, if we invoke Oedipus again, you say, what does he do after he realized that he killed his father and he slept with his mother? What does he do? Well, he stabs out his eyes, doesn't he? Now, the real challenge of psychoanalysis, and it's a very difficult challenge, as we all know, is to ask the patient to continue looking after he's realized, to see that he's devastated his life, for example. The damage he's caused, the suffering he's caused. And that is very, very difficult to do for any one of us. And I think as analysts and perhaps also as psychiatrists, we can only demand that the patients attempt to do this. So difficult task, yeah? If we are willing to face our own madness as it crops up in the treatment. And the madness I was pointing to is my own disinterest for the patient who's coming, who's evidently suffering a lot, yeah? And who finds an analyst who, for these sessions, for these moments, yeah, is completely disregarding of the patient. Yeah, and it's once we face our own, in this case, disinterested, yeah, rejecting aspect, that we can then again access the patient in a different way and more productive manner. Okay, thank you very much. So these are a few ideas, and I hope some of it can be useful for further discussion. Yeah?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I'm very glad to join you this way. As director of the Sigmund Freud Museum since 7 years, I was privileged as an art historian. I'm not a psychoanalyst, I'm an art historian and cultural worker. So now I will give you very briefly a short example how we try as a museum to communicate the legacy of Freud and the birthplace of psychoanalysis at Berggasse 19 in Vienna, where Freud, as you know, lived and worked for almost 50 years. And so it was a challenge, also because this space is empty. A colleague once called it a court memory space, because Freud was able to leave the terror regime of the Nazis in June 1938, and he took all belongings with him. So the icon of psychoanalysis, the couch, so the symbol of the psychoanalytic setting, of free association, of the writing desk of Freud, the icon of his developing his theories, is he took all with him into his Londoner exile. So what remained is an empty space. And I think as a cultural worker that the contents you decide to depict have a great impact on the way how they are presented, how they are shown to the people, how they are communicated. So it might be a little bit similar to your practice, because you have to choose your voice and words like Freud did as an instrument. It's not only what you ask or what you are listening to, it's of course also the question of how you do it. So, and a way to communicate psychoanalysis on its birthplace, the origin of psychoanalysis in this empty house, is through the movement of the visitors, for instance. So they take the same path, the same way through the house. And if they enter the former treatment room by Freud, they have a wall in front of them where in former times the couch stood. And you have, and that's also very close to the psychoanalytic practice, you have to envision in order to see. Because the only thing you can see, because the couch is not here anymore, we dismantled, we removed the paint from the wall, and you see the naked, pure plaster. But what you see are the traces. You see little holes of the nails with Freud pinned his carpet behind his famous couch in the wall. That is all that remained. Of course, we are a little bit supporting in a curatorial way the imagination, the visualization in front of the inner mind's eye with a little part of a photography. So if I describe it now to you, you have to do the same. You have to envision in order to see, to imagine what I'm speaking about. We made the experience, we opened this new installation of the exhibition of work and life of Anna and Sigmund Freud some month ago. Of course, because of the pandemic, we have to close, and we can open again and have to close. again, but we made the experience that our clients, our visitors, think that this kind of presenting delivers an adequate situation to visualize and to connect with the past. And what we also experience is that we have a lot of young visitors. So before we had to close, before the pandemic, we had 100,000 and 10,000 visitors a year on only 280 square meters. So you can imagine it's like a pilgrimage place. And the people are visiting and looking for something that make it possible for them to find their position in our society. And they want to learn about the way how we can express our perversions and anxieties, and also how we can listen to them. So it's not, as Dr. Huppert before mentioned, it's not only a pathological topic, so issue for the clinic, it's also a cultural phenomenon, and especially in these days. So there are a lot of people who have the desire to come to the place to be informed or to think about empathy, for instance, or to think about respect and how you can deal with these psychological terms, and at the same time to find, to make it more easy to act against the isolation, for instance, and to connect with the other. Lacan would say also to accept and to connect with the other in yourself. So, and like Lacan, Slavoj Žižek do that also with perceiving the perception of arts. So we tried to lay the focus on how to present Freud's theories and ideas. And in the meantime, it looked like that it worked out very well. So thank you.
I would like to thank everybody who has invited me and enabled me to be here from far the snowfields of Latvia, where I am right now. So I can see a lot of people that I recognize here, and some whom I don't. First of all, Dr. Matthias from the Austrian Embassy, Mr. Bale from the Austrian Cultural Forum, Dr. Raheja from the Delhi Psychiatric Society and the IAPP-Delhi Chapter, and the State Mental Health Authority, Delhi, Hope Care, India. And I see my teacher here, Dr. Nagpal, whom I actually don't see. And I see a lot of colleagues and also students from all over the world, India, Pakistan, Iran. So we are really reaching the corners of the world with this event. I have a suspicion that I'm an interloper here, filling in for a person who should have been here, would have been our teacher, the eminent psychoanalyst Sudhir Kakar. He would have been the right person to address this event. And I'm trying to fill in shoes which are far too big. So confronted with the Second World War and other pushes and pulls, psychoanalysts soon started emigrating from Vienna to the rest of Europe, and soon across the Atlantic too. You know, you could hear the hums and of the psychoanalyst. Psychoanalysts and psychoanalysis adapted to what I like to call the terroir, in which they found themselves. This is a term from another discipline which I'm interested in, that of wine making and wine drinking, in which they found themselves and gave birth to a different psychoanalysis de terroir. Now, in England, with its obsession with nannies, gave birth to object relations theory. France, with its proud philosophical tradition, gave birth to Lacanian analysis and to the Société Psychoanalytique de Paris, to which I belonged to till quite recently, with its unique emphasis on language, the paternal, and close logical reasoning. The USA leaned towards ego psychology, self-psychology, and more recently to interpersonal, intersubjective, and as Professor Nagpal, my teacher, will talk to you about relational, Freud being the relational guru. South America leaned towards a rather artistic blend of object relations and Bionian analysis. Bion, as you all know, was born and brought up for the first few years of his life in India. And his psychoanalytic theory and technique, many people believe, is influenced by Indian, believe it or not, metaphysics. India was the lost tribe of psychoanalysis. Its founder, Dr. Girindra Shekhar Bose, being the only other psychoanalyst besides Freud to never have been analyzed by another psychoanalyst. The best of Indian psychoanalysis gave birth to transcultural psychoanalysis, which is exemplified and seen in the writings of Professor Sudhir Kakkar, Salman Akhtar, Dr. Ashok Nagpal, and Anup Dhar, who might join us later. Each school chose a different part of the elephant Freud to catch and identify with. It's the story of the elephant and various people catching different parts of it and identifying that as the elephant. So in England, they identified with a certain part, in USA with a certain part, in France with a certain part, and so on. So, one second, let me see if I hope I've not skipped a slide. Yeah. So during the course of nearly a century of psychoanalytic emigration and transformation, many psychotherapies arose. Some flourished, some subsided, and some became incorporated in others. To name a few, Gestalt therapy, behavior therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and so on. But none, in my view, and that of Eric Kandel, the Nobel Prize winner, had as satisfying a metapsychology as psychoanalysis. In the meanwhile, the species Homo psychoanalyticus, which was born in the clinic, came to inhabit mostly national and international psychoanalytical associations. Doctors soon became a minority, and practices were soon located in individual, tastefully decorated offices away from the hospital and clinic. Psychoanalysts started treating clients rather than patients, and psychoanalysis, from being a medical discipline, became a part of the humanities. Psychoanalysis, which was born in the attempt to treat adult hysterical patients, was soon applied. Your audio is on. Mute it. Psychoanalysis, which was born in the attempt to treat adult hysterical patients, was soon applied to other age groups and pathologies as well. It was applied to children and indeed to childhood, depression, mania, psychosis, and personality disorders, with consequent changes in metapsychology, epistemology, and technique. In fact, a lot of psychoanalysts and psychoanalysis came to film and literature theory, art, and gender studies. The line between psychoanalysis and the psychoanalytical became blurred. But what is interesting is that while the metapsychology continued to be elaborated in some places, the unarticulated metaphysics of psychoanalysis, on which the entire edifice of psychoanalysis stood, was articulated by the sign of the negative, in which I invoke the work of the French psychoanalyst André Green. The psychoanalysts were defined by what they didn't believe in often. They didn't believe in God, spirits, mysticism, or increasingly they started not believing or not paying attention to biology. The psychoanalytic identity like other identities, was not only carved by what they believed in, but was increasingly carved out by the knife of this negative, which could fall like the sword of Damocles, excising those who strayed across the Lakshman Rekha. For Westerners, the Lakshman Rekha would be defined as the forbidden line. The Indian people might understand it a bit in a different way, but more or less similar. The Promethean psychoanalytic human psyche, to whom no sphinx could ask question of its origin. Nobody could say, hey, where did you come from? Till we were confronted by the coronavirus sphinx, which has in the span of a year shifted us from the modern and postmodern human era into the post-postmodern or post-human era. This is the fourth revolution which had been anticipated by many. To name a few of my favorites, Deleuze and Guattari, Timothy Morton, and many others, who had earlier been dealing with the environmental crisis, noted the existence of hyper-objects, objects which are so widely distributed that we can't fathom them and their impact, like carbon particles in the environment or even our own DNA. They gave birth to a field in philosophy called object-oriented ontology, which essentially says, and which some people find difficult to believe, is that humans are part of the non-human world, that our claims of human exceptionalism are wildly exaggerated. The coronavirus is one of the most basic pieces of code or information. Now, we are all surrounded by code. The code in DNA, the code in computers, the code in radio and wireless. Our planet is engulfed with code. When this coronavirus inserts itself into the human organism, it can bring not only the organism, but all of human civilization, in which it took so much pride, tumbling down like Humpty Dumpty. And all of human narcissism could not put Humpty Dumpty back together. When we look at the pieces of Humpty Dumpty, we find the same building blocks of which the coronavirus is built, the same nucleic acids. In fact, wherever we look around us, we find the same chemicals in the grass, in the trees, in the animals, and even in the rocks and sand around us. It can be said that all of human civilization is the result of the self-organizing properties of these chemicals. These chemicals organize themselves into bigger and bigger molecules, eventually forming organic molecules, then formed viruses, bacteria, unicellular organisms, multicellular organisms, and a short hop later, you and me. And you and me started thinking, and eventually we produced psychoanalysis. So all of human civilization can be said to be the result of the self-organizing properties of these chemicals. And is psychoanalysis not a product of civilization? It is a product of these same chemicals. Why doesn't it pay heed to these chemicals which have made it? Increasingly, in the last 15-20 years especially, the study of molecular and genetic neuroscience is rapidly obliterating the difference between neuroscience and psychiatry. We are finding the neural, molecular, and genetic pathways that underlie a host of symptoms and even personality structures. We are moving away from a syndromal classification and treatment paradigm to one based on understanding the molecular and genetic etiopathogenesis. This is leading to greater integration amongst the medical sciences. This doesn't preclude the existence of distinct disciplines like neurology or internal medicine or endocrinology, but it calls eventually for a metaphysics based on science, that reality is not just a social construct. Psychoanalysis risks being categorized with flat earthers and anti-vaxxers if it doesn't recognize the legacy of the scientific Freud, the neuroresearcher who preceded the person who started dealing with hysteria, was the researcher who dissected many, many eels to find the neural pathway of eels. He was also Freud. At the time when he was researching, the tools at his disposal didn't enable him to continue very far on the on that line. I'm sure if he was alive today, he would recognize that psychoanalysis is not just hermeneutics, but also heuristics. It's not just about, exegesis. The psychoanalytic Oedipus at Colonus must recognize that it has indeed killed its father. Its father was science, and married its mother, hermeneutics, whose seductive embrace, that of theology maybe, it fell into and thus became blinded. It is time for psychoanalysis to see the hyper-objects which underlie object relations, to go from what Wilfred Bion would call O to OOO, object-oriented ontology. It is time to recognize the name of the father, to quote Lacan, under which it was born, science, and engage with reality, or risk jumping out of Alan Sokal's famed window. So I'll end with this presentation here, and maybe we can discuss it later after Dr. Nagpal has spoken, because he has a unique felicity of integrating everything which has been said and everything which has not been said. So if any questions remain after his lecture, maybe we can attend to that.
Psychoanalysis is closer to a story that begins from anywhere and could end anywhere. And I try to bring in few clinical moments in sessions to get some flavors of what is it that goes on by which madness becomes a somewhat respectable experience. I'll go slow, so whenever the time is up, just let me know. It doesn't matter. Stories have their own pulls. They draw us from God knows where. And I think when I was hearing Anurag in the last part, especially on the triple O, and his urging that I will be able to link up, I thought I could touch states during the pandemic, particularly in India, where so much about our social political life is changing, and changing in ways that we sometimes feel clueless. And during the pandemic, I think the cluelessness was at the forefront, hitting us, making us question as psychoanalysts, as psychoanalytic thinking, what is it that we ignored so much, that when our parents and grandparents have begun speaking to us out of traditions that we in our directions to evolve, which were somewhat at a departure. We were more westernized, much more drawn to the idea of individuation. Then now that our parents and grandparents have begun speaking to us, we felt we are at a loss to see this massive change. So no wonder the story begins with a dream that I had in the morning. I was certainly tense about the occasion, the internet part, 15 minutes within which to draw critical thoughts from Freud's life, Freud's works, and the aliveness that Freud represents in most critical situations for me, for some of us. How will I reproduce this? And I'm in my dream, a small dream fragment in a colony, which could be anywhere in the middle class parts of our city, unrecognizable but familiar. It has congested residences in a straight, plain-looking lane with balconies, windowsills, and parapets. As a dreamer, I'm a young dreamer, trickily positioned on a windowsill of a house on a floor, which must be quite high because I can see that if I were to lose my balance, I will certainly receive grievous injuries, if not death. But important thing is my language is I'll receive death. And I discover it's a house from where I can converse with my grandmother, long dead. Even as I'm hanging, she is uncharacteristically unaffected by the precariousness of my perch. Instead, concerned about my father, who she believes has passed away. And she's sharing it with me in an intensely lost, overwhelmed manner. Do I know he's no more? I was absent from my father's life. I'm struggling with hanging in literally. With the news, she has broken to me, but also with an inner knowing that I sense his whereabouts. There is an excitement, something exciting, an exciting certainty that he's very much in a house adjoining the lane I'm currently in. And somewhat mysteriously, I start on the venture to locate him and bring him over to meet her. Of course, I'm made aware by the dream mode. It'll be too risky to go on shifting from one parapet to another ledge and so on. So I wake up, absorbing ruminations about this occasion later in the afternoon. How writing this talk has presented me with an experience of long dead kin of mine, a grandmother, father, having been brought alive and joined to my energies. The dream poorly conceals my anguish of having only 15 minutes to report a life-transforming healing practice and clinical thinking around it. So parapets appoint you as my audience to hold me, catch me, even as I, in a childlike exuberance, bring to you Freud, an immortal paternity to human psyche, lovingly cajoled by the grandmotherly traditions. 17 years back, when I was involved in a project on partition in the subcontinent with Professor Nandi, I would be confronted with this question by participants from five different countries. How has partition affected me personally? And I would be filled with a numbing silence. For 5 long years of my involvement with this project, I kept this as a companion mood state, only to lose it somewhere. And thereafter, each occasion, such as this one, that I feel has graced me to feel like being a son to this incredibly arduous work of Freud. Remember, dreams as the royal road to unconscious. Now, before Freud chose medicine at the age of 17, in preference to law and politics, he heard Goethe's Ode to Nature, which was, of course, wrongly attributed. I think Goethe had written something else called Nature, a Fragment. I'll read a paragraph on that. My parapets and paragraphs are to be confused today because I'm standing on them. Nature, we are surrounded by and entangled in it, incapable of escaping from it and incapable of penetrating deeper inside it. Without being asked and without warning, it draws us into the vortex of its dance and sweeps us away until we are exhausted and drop from its arms. It creates eternally new forms. That which exists never was before. That which was never comes again. Everything is new and yet forever old. We live in its midst, yet are strangers to it. It speaks with us ceaselessly, yet does not betray to us its secret. We act on it continuously, yet have no sway over it. It seems to have staked everything on individuality, yet does not know what to do with individuals. It always builds and always destroys. Its forge is inaccessible. It lives through its children, but where is the mother? It is the only real artist. Out of the simplest material, the great contrast, without a hint of effort, the greatest perfection, the most precise determination, yet always topped with something soft. Each of its works has its own essence, each of its appearance the most singular characterization, yet it makes out of everything a unity. Even the most unnatural thing is nature. He who does not see it everywhere doesn't see it correctly anywhere. We obey its laws even when we go against them. We work with it, even when we want to work against it. I think this, for me, has held moments in the last few years to bring in the maternal feminine, that part of Freudian thinking has evolved, but not without its destructive aspects, such as this piece of elegy brings to us. I am recalling three conditions first, or three basic principles of psychoanalysis that Freud discovered. To each, enough context should have been provided, and I'm sure the other two speakers and three speakers have done that for us. So the first one is that one can study the human mind only by engaging the fully motivated partnership of the observed individual and by entering into a sincere contract with her or him. So contract has two partners. This changed image of the patient also changes the self-image of the listener, the doctor. When Anurag said that now the patient becomes a client, perhaps we might also add to it the connotation of that the patient, insofar as he has the observer instated in him, is to be treated as a client. Which leads us to the second one, that you will not see in you will not see in another what you have not learned to recognize in yourself. The mental healer must divide himself as well as the patient into an observer and an observed. Now, these two principles we know are cousins of many a spiritual practice. Perhaps the term, the excess of observer-observed militates a little bit, but nonetheless, this thing to sort of see in oneself what the other is going through, to get the fully motivated partnership of the other is often conjured by other terms in many spiritual disciplines, surrender being one of the most prominent ones. Yeah. The third principle, since I am rushing into things, is a crucial one, which emphasizes the irrational part of it, the irrational part of psychological discovery. That psychological discovery is accompanied by some irrational involvement of the observer, and that it cannot be communicated to another without a certain irrational involvement of both. This for me is a very crucial part because it opens a doorway that healing in psychotherapy, psychoanalysis is never without the irrational. So what do we live as listeners? What do we live as speakers to ourselves when our client or patient or the one who is under a heavy pall of being observed goes silent? After all, free association has a paradox. It can be begun as an instruction, and it can also point out the termination. The day one's associations are free, our work is over. So in free association, as a listener, I think about so much from my own life. From my own life, if my son is getting married, I will think about arrangements that have to be done, which are troubling me. And I would also have a critical way of receiving a lining of it. Does it have a meaning here? Does it have a particular meaning here? I may not be able to think about that so soon. I may just be going on until I reach a point when it becomes suddenly a reverie. That I have no idea that in a mundane part of my life, while listening to a girl patient, a woman patient, who is not thought about her marriage, and who perhaps will not, given the trends think about her marriage, but who is nonetheless silent. And whereas in my own life, my son's marriage is about to happen, how are the two converging? Is there something in my patient's life which is being intuited here? The softness of the maternal. Is there something by which I would begin to have a small fetal head to a life that is unable to push itself in that direction, to at least imagine it, or at least let there be a dread of the hallucinatory image that I am getting married. How do I reach I am getting married? I know marriage is not the fad these days. So this is just to sort of give you a few of the smaller ends in which I can also think about another mother who is not my client, whose son reports about an episode, and he has been reporting this episode repetitively, an episode in the life of a cousin, a brother, and one day as a kind of a fight that happened when the cousin and the brother were just 6, 7, 8, that the son did not feel sufficiently understood by the mother and must have protested about something. And the argument became so much that he threatened to leave the home at the age of 7 or 8. And the mother happened to have found nothing else but to say, if you are leaving our home, leave your clothes here. They are also ours. In Hindi, she said, Hamare kapde utar. Now, that is, remove our clothes. And there are many other episodes that have come in, but this is one episode in which this particular meaning, that how a mother's statement to say, Hamare kapde utar, take off our clothes, takes us to a pit from the point of view of a 7-year-old, 8-year-old child. And what would he do with it? And he literally takes off his clothes and walks into the street until he's halted by a few other women, aunts, who are so shocked by this and say, how could you? How could you do this? And they bring this boy back, pleading with the mother that don't take it that far. We know this is just one window into the trauma of this man who has gone on living a life of abstinence, so much so that he becomes a yogi. Something about bodies one needs to bring in, because it's this which is the toughest. And then I'll just give you one longer vignette and stop, which might help us look at why Freud had to bring in, as Erikson says, too many things under the under the rubric of sexuality, rather than too few things. Was Freud deeply hoping that succeeding generations will clarify to the humanity that it's much better to begin with too many things as sexual rather than too few things as sexual, because about sexual we are tongue-tied, except my kudos to the present generation, which promises to sort of fathom, dive into all kinds of nooks and corners. So bodies is a way. When Freud says dream is the royal road to unconscious, I would say sexuality is that surface that undulates, the depth and the surface, in a way in which we are so self-lost that we make a contact with the other. Sometimes this contact is dreadful, beyond words. Perhaps in those moments we are particles, like losing a parapet, the hold on that, the toe hold on something, on a ledge, and God knows what abyss waits us. It's through through this that now I'll take you to the last minute, that dread, panic, and an articulation. Like a story, it is telling us how does a psychoanalyst move from a reverie, difficult reverie, a deep thought in which he becomes aware of something that he thinks has some relevance because it's too striking, too strange. Could there be that part of the nature, that strangeness that Goethe speaks about? It's a longish, 2-page long thing, so please bear with me. It also tells us, by the way, of the amendment in psychoanalytic technique that has gone on, going beyond transference and countertransference, the notion of a reverie where the unconscious to unconscious communication happens. And it's as if unconscious is being protected by the conscious, from the conscious. I'm sorry. Unconscious is protected from the conscious. And how do you speak this? How do you keep it by and large protected? This is about Miss C. This is the analyst is Thomas Ogden. Miss C, who has been meeting for several years in a 5 sessions per week analysis, when I began to feel on meeting her in the waiting room that she was in the wrong place and that I should tell her politely that the person she came to see was located in another building on the same block as mine. This feeling was particularly puzzling because I was fond of Miss C and almost always looked forward to seeing her for her sessions. When the patient lay down on the couch that same day, I had the impulse to say, I love you. And analysts negotiate, I feel, acutest difficulties in this direction, not as much in the direction of periodic resentments and other feelings of disturbance vis-a-vis patients, but I think to come to this impulse that I love you in a manner which is preceded, in which he has also felt a kind of a dissociation with all his fondness vis-a-vis the patient. So Miss C, he hasn't said this to the patient, Miss C tells him a dream in which she had lost something but didn't know what she had lost. I said, this is Thomas Ogden. So when I say this is Thomas Ogden. Is loving me such a terrible thing that you have to leave it somewhere else when you come to see me? I had not planned to say this to the patient, but it felt true as I said it. This feeling true can be a bugbear. It just doesn't let you go. When you feel true, you express it. And when you express it, rarely you experience what I experienced the dream as on the parapet, on the ledge. Without pause, Miss C responded, you've never told me that you loved me before. I said, would my love be in the wrong place if I were to love you? Patient, yes, I think it would. But I would feel empty if I were to give it back. I replied, again without pause, as you were speaking, I couldn't tell whether you meant that you would feel empty if you simply returned my love as something unwanted, something you had no use for, or whether you meant that feeling love for me would make you feel empty. Kind of a deeper, scary, paranoid emptiness to at least a kind of a balancing of a delicate one, which is I'll feel this and I'll also feel this. Paradoxes or contradictions. She says, I mean both. You shouldn't love me. I'm a patient. And I also feel that I love you. But I feel that it's being directed at no one because you are here in form only, not as a real man I could go out with and possibly marry. That's not just a feeling. It's a fact that can't be undone. This is a case, by the way, published in International Journal, in 2014. So all the societal movement of being against marriage has a kind of a meeting with this case, meeting with this dynamic, a possible meeting for us to draw from. So Ogden says, when you tell me about facts that can't be undone, I feel as if you're killing something or someone. You kill the person you love by saying, I don't exist, and by saying I'm no one. So it's a waste of life to give me the love that you feel. I paused and then said, I think that in one way you would like to hear me say, you and your love are in the right place. This is exactly the place for them. But in another way, it would be terribly frightening if I were to say that. So yes, I have to stop. I know. Just give me 2 more minutes, okay? 2 more minutes, literally. I wanted to say that if we had gone further into this, then Miss C turns out to be having had a dream the previous night before coming to the session, in which she thinks about a baby, a fetus, male fetus that she had lost a few years ago, and as a result had come under a heavy gloom, by which she began suspecting, almost psychotically, that she is incapable of loving. And so Ogden makes a case to say that when I experienced that impulse, I love you, it was the fetus, it was for the woman, it was for myself. He would have given us more details about what he means by fetus as myself. But I was also trying to bring in the vignette to say that an analyst is all the while close to personal crises. For the Indian tale to this, because this tale has no father. This vignette has no father. So Ogden assumes the father, the image of the father, the communication of the husband and the father. But in the Indian tale of Abhimanyu, we have a fetus listening to a father and a mother before the fetus is lost, sacrificed 16 years later in Chakravyuh, which we have learned to see as somersaults in life, in plurispheres of life, such as perhaps Anurag was bringing in by his hyper-object. But I am not interested in simplifying that. I'm just suggesting that there is something about the Indian reality where these processes are not easily lost. They are given a certain tenure. Let's hope that our collective guru, Professor Kakkar, who says that the time for Asian psychoanalysis is ripe, is close by. Thank you very much.
It's such a pleasure. It's such a pleasure to be here with Dina Boradi, Madam Dina Boradi, his wife Deepak Said, our senior patron-like figure. But there are more formalities. Thank you, Deepak Raheja sir, and the Austrian High Commission, the Cultural Affairs Section sir, for organizing this, for kind of rejuvenating interest in a topic that begins to get faded.
Psychoanalysis is something which is, I think, very deeply imprinted on the minds of all psychiatrists and psychologists. Nobody can, whenever we join psychiatry, as soon as the Sigmund Freud comes to our mind.
Thank you very much. So, psychoanalysis is a theory. It's a method of investigation. It's also a therapy. So all the 3 aspects of psychoanalysis are there, and one has to know about each aspect.
Dr. Monika or Dr. Huppert?
I would like to emphasize that, one often emphasizes, also in Austria, one emphasizes in these kinds of discussions that psychoanalysis is both fundamental and irrelevant at the very same time. Yes, because people don't have the money, they don't come, it's only for supposedly rich patients and so on. My own experience has been rather different, I think if you're really passionate as an analyst, you can actually convince people to come 4 times a week. There are, at least in Europe, and this is maybe a difference, also possibilities of having treatments in kind of polyclinics, for patients. And the other aspect, which I think is very important, I mean, in view of psychiatric discussions, is that psychoanalysis can help at various levels. One would be, I think, that the psychiatrist or the psychotherapist is, of course, an instrument for understanding, and that his own analysis or his own access to his own psychological workings is essential, and the more disturbed the patient is, the more work the analyst has to do to try to understand and to contain and to elaborate, what the patient is saying or what is really happening to the person, So I think at one fundamental level, which I think is important, I've had psychiatrists being patients of mine, and that this is, as far as I can see, transformed them as psychiatrists. And they don't work as analysts; they're working as psychiatrists. But they have a different access to themselves, a different understanding. Also within crisis situations where they don't act as analysts at all, they're in the hospital, but they have a different ability to contain, to decipher, to attune themselves to what is going on in the patient. And perhaps the last point I wanted to say is that psychoanalysis, of course, also offers a powerful theoretical basis for understanding clinical conditions, from the neurosis to the psychosis, and that these are extremely relevant for psychiatric treatment. One last point I want to make, because it's a kind of statement which has been quoted so often, that Freud supposedly said that the dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, and there's a misunderstanding there. That's not what he said. He's never said that. Dreams are the royal road to the knowledge of the unconscious. So Kenntnis des Unbewussten. And there's a huge difference because, you see, there is no royal road to the unconscious. The unconscious is not a place. We never access it. It's always opaque. Yes? It's always inaccessible. The only thing we can do is transform something from what has been unconscious to conscious. But we don't ever arrive to the unconscious as we might arrive to Rome. And in this distinction, which might seem subtle or small, I think the whole discipline of psychoanalysis is actually based on it. That we're accessing something which is obtuse and unknowable, in a direct form, and that any form of knowledge we can have of it is already a transformation. A transformation which is also therapeutic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I can jump in for a little bit. I actually would like to, add my support to what Dr. Huppert has said. And in fact, I have many students now and in India, all of them therapists, and not a single one of them has any time left. They're all full with patients. The relationship between psychoanalysis and psychiatry is very much like the relationship between Freud's carpet and the wall behind it. I was one of those 110,000 people who visited the museum. A beautiful place, Bargaz 19, and I took back photographs and posters from there, which were on my clinic for nearly 20 years now in India, though now I am in Latvia. They are still there. And the psychoanalytic carpet must be attached to the reality of the world with nails, not crucified on the wall, but must be attached. And if we manage to attach it, then we can have both the wall of psychiatry, neurochemistry, and so on, as well as the beauty of the carpet. As Dr. Nagpal has become a grandfather, he gets to enjoy, hopefully, a grandson, and not just heed the siren call of his own grandparents to come, leave his body behind and come to the beyond. We must resist that. We are the nails which join the carpet to the wall. the beautiful wall of Dr. Huppert and Dr. Pessler. And this beauty must be maintained, but it always comes at a price. Sorry if I was a bit opaque.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra, for your very nice and full of metaphoric quality description and narrative of this relationship between psychoanalysis and our reality. And I think what became really clear is that the desire to find a way to understand ourselves and the other only could really be expressed if you accept that it is a process, and that the patient, like also the visitor of a museum, it's a little bit similar. We know that they know everything. So the only thing we can prepare something like an instrument for their perception and for finding, because they don't know that they know. I think somebody already said that. And I think that it's very helpful to discuss with different people, also especially from different cultures, how we can be trained better to see from very different perspectives how the other and we self are working out, functioning. So, and that is the second task. We have not only this motto, envisioning in order to see, preparing our exhibitions. We also had, I made a concept, it's called Speak Freely. In German, frei sprechen. What of course means, and it's a leitmotif for our scientific program and discussions. So we can learn a lot to become aware and to think consciously about terms like love, I love you, or speak freely, speak yourself free from something, or speak freely. And yeah, I think we should have more discussions from one corner of the world to the other to think more about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will try my best to put in few words as that is asked. As we all know, psychoanalysis is a theory of psychopathology and treatment of mental disorder.
A very good afternoon. I think I'll be able to keep everyone awake. At the outset, I just want to share a few points because time given to me is just 2 minutes. So the principles of psychoanalysis and the Freudian work, this has a lot of understanding in the current scenario. We've been using the principles of transference, countertransference, defense mechanisms, and the dream work, as well as we are using the principles of hypnosis and hypnotherapy in our day-to-day clinical practice. I want to share my clinical work with this august audience. This year only, we have done a work of hypnosis in dental extractions in the pediatric age group patients, and we were able to demonstrate significant reductions in the anxiety levels prior to dental extraction in the group of study subjects around 8 to 12 years of age who received hypnosis. So not only is this work, these works, they are, one should not think that they are like old vintage cars, summarized at the end. We have to use their principles, and if we have clarity on our own thought process, if we understand ourselves, that is, if we do our own psychoanalysis, and then we emerge as better human beings, and as clinicians, and especially as Delhi psychiatrists, we have to overcome the negative countertransference for the patients, as well as a lot of principles of in the day-to-day practice of making the unconscious thoughts, conflicts, they are surfaced out to consciousness and the patients show resolution in symptoms. So whatever be the approaches to psychotherapy that one uses, be it, it's most commonly the eclectic kind of approach that we use in the clinical practice, and there we do use a lot of principles, we do a lot of dynamic formulation. Many a times we are not able to achieve good results with cognitive behavior therapy. So we have to spend more time and take these difficult cases, and we are able to understand the patients in a holistic way if we've done a psychodynamic formulation for the case. So not only we teach to our undergraduates, we teach to our postgraduates the basic theory, the basic principles, and as in this very year only, I've written this thesis work, and as I'm happy to share the house that these early stages of hypnosis, they brought about reduction in anxiety symptoms, both subjective and objective parameters, and both the need for the local anesthesia as well as the analgesics prior to dental extraction, they showed improvement, and the two papers have been accepted in the international journal within this year.
I have to leave now, but I would but I would really like to wish Dr. Desai excellent ride with a prima donna in a vintage car, followed hopefully by a lovely dinner.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. See you. Bye.
Well, I'd like to thank on behalf of Austrian Culture Forum Mr. Matthias Radovic, sincere thanks, and also to our, and also I would like to thank at the same time our online guests who have joined us, and definitely it was an interesting, very, very interesting session, and very special thanks to Dr. Raheja, without whom I don't think so this particular session would have been possible. Thank you very much indeed, and we look forward to such sessions more in future. Thanks again. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. There are so many other thanks which we'd like to convey, but then I'm not being able to. I might miss some names. So we have a list of thanks which we would like to say. Dr. Nagpal is here.